phenomenal cosmic powers!
Well, hello out there on the internet. Welcome back to In Response, a Magic the Gathering channel focused on the rules and interactions of this game we love. My name is TS, and in this episode, we're going to cover the most basic foundation of just about everything that happens in this game, and that is how to cast a spell. A lot of it gets shortcut throughout most players' experience, and there can be some interactions that get lost or get confusing if you don't know what the steps are of how you cast that spell. So with that in mind, we're going to dive on in, and as always, remember to follow every rule we discuss with the phrase, unless a card says otherwise. So let's talk about a few terms and foundations, and then we'll go into casting that spell. Currently, in the game of Magic, there are 9 different card types. We have Artifact, Battle, Creature, Enchantment, Instant, Kindred, Land, Planeswalker, and Sorcery. Now, among those card types, Land is the only one we do not cast to get into play. Now, among the spells we have available, the 2 most important to understand first are going to be instant and sorcery spells, because the timing of when you are allowed to cast these spells is something that we're going to apply to every spell moving forward, and even a lot of abilities that are not spells. The unofficial term that many players use is instant speed and sorcery speed, but that is not an official phrasing that is used in this game. The official wording is going to be when you can cast an instant, or when you can cast a sorcery. But a lot of players just say instant speed or sorcery speed to reference these 2 things. An instant is a spell that we can cast anytime we have priority. This means during your turn or an opponent's turn, anytime after the upkeep has started and before the cleanup step has begun. Any point in between those times, whenever you have priority, you may cast an instant. A sorcery is a little bit more specific about when you're able to cast that spell. It must be during your turn, during one of your main phases, and while the stack is empty. If those 3 conditions are met, the game will allow you to cast a sorcery. Now, by default, any spell that is not an instant may only be cast whenever you may cast a sorcery. So, during your turn, during your main phase, when the stack is empty. Now, as with everything, there are exceptions to these timing rules, and there are some finer details we'll get into in a later episode. But for now, I do want to introduce the basic concepts while we're on the topic. Some spells will have what is called flash. Flash is a keyword that allows a spell that normally may only be cast as a sorcery to be cast as an instant. So anytime you have priority, even if it's not your turn. Now, on the other side of that, some spells and abilities may restrict the timing so that they may only be cast as a sorcery, even if they would have been able to be cast as an instant. Now, the last thing we need to understand before we begin to cast our spell is what a mana ability is. Most of us are probably familiar with a basic mana ability, such as tapping a land for mana. but it does go a little deeper than that. By definition, to be a mana ability, it must have 3 truths about it. Number 1, it must produce mana. That's pretty straightforward. Number 2, the ability cannot target anything. It can have other effects, as long as none of those effects target any object or player. And number 3, it cannot be a loyalty ability of a planeswalker. As long as it fits all 3 of those criteria, it is a mana ability. There are 2 reasons this distinction is so important. The first is that mana abilities do not use the stack and may not be responded to. If I activate an ability or cast a spell or anything that uses the stack, my opponents have an opportunity to respond, and that response may stop what I was trying to do. However, activating a mana ability does not use the stack. When I tap my lands for mana, my opponent has no opportunity to interact with that. The second reason is that while casting a spell in the middle of the process, no player gets priority to take any action. However, there is a step in that process of casting the spell where you may be allowed to activate mana abilities. But if an ability produces mana but has a target, for example, it may not be activated in the middle of casting that spell. You'll have to find a different time to do it. Well, I think we're ready to go through the steps of casting a spell. The first step is to simply propose casting the spell. You do this by moving the card from your hand to the stack. After that, you make any choices the spell asks you to make. There could be no choices, like casting a normal creature, or there could be any number of the following. If it has multiple modes, you must make that choice now. If the cast has an X value, you have to decide what X is now. If there are any additional costs, you have to take that into account. If they are optional costs, you must decide now if you are going to add those to the spell. Or if there is an alternate cost, perhaps for a different effect, you must make that choice now. Then, if the spell has any targets, you make those choices of what you're targeting now. If the spell asks you to divide or distribute, such as dividing damage among multiple targets, or distributing counters onto multiple creatures, for example, you make those decisions now. Then we check to make sure all of our choices so far are legal. If they're not, we rewind and make sure and go through those steps again until everything checks out legal. Once we're past that point, we determine the cost of the spell based on the mana value. If there was an X value we determined, if there were additional costs or alternate costs from our previous step. Once we've determined that, we add any tax effects that may add additional costs on top of what we've already had. Then we apply any relevant cost reductions that may be there. And then finally, if there's a Trinisphere in play, we apply that if necessary. Once we determine the cost, we activate any necessary mana abilities now, so that we have what we need to pay for the spell. And finally, the last step in the process of casting our spell is to pay it with whatever cost that is. If it requires mana, we pay that mana now from the mana abilities we've already activated. Some spells may have costs involving sacrificing a permanent or discarding a card, but those spells will say that specifically. Once we've gone through all of these steps, our spell is now on the stack, and we pass priority to see if it resolves. And finally, I want to talk briefly about the mana symbols that are on the card itself in the upper right corner. Normally, we're used to reading things from left to right. For reading the cost of the spell, I recommend going from right to left, especially when multiple colors are involved. This will help you better understand what types of mana you're going to need for that spell. For example, if you're casting Cultivate, you need 1 green mana specifically, and then 2 mana of any type. For Thought Reflection, you need 3 specifically blue mana, and then 4 of any type. For something like Temple Bell, you just need 3 mana. It doesn't matter what type it is. The number inside of that gray circle is what we refer to as generic mana. For Morska, Undersea Sleuth, you need specifically 1 blue, 1 white, and 1 green. And then also, for Flayer of Loyalties, you need 2 colorless mana, and then 8 more of any type. Well, there you have it. We've got our spell on the stack, and we're ready to see what happens. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the stack, priority, and how those interact in a 1 versus 1 game, but also how they work in a multiplayer game where things can get just a little hectic. So, until then, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.
You're going out of turn.
I thought I went after Simmons.
No, we go in line. It goes you, then me, then Simmons, then back down to me, then you, then me, then Simmons, then me, then Simmons, me, Simmons, you, Simmons, me, Simmons, you, me, then me again. It makes perfect sense.
But doesn't that mean you go twice as much? Or 10 times as much?